Welcome to Prelude to Ulysses. This is Alex reads something. We haven't decided yet. I can either start reading more of Ancient Evenings, or I'll read a poem out of M. Scott Momaday. I'm going to see how long this poem is out of M. Scott. It's very, very short. I've been avoiding reading this, so let's do it. Today is a day of doing the things you avoided doing. All right. So we're on the Book of the Charioteer still. Part 4. I'm just not as into this part of the book, I think. But it gets better. All I have is like 120 more pages of the Book of the Charioteer. So let's go. This is Alex Reads Ancient Evenings. Part 4. The Book of the Charioteer, Part 4. I don't remember what happened last time. What? They have like a sacrifice, I forgot. Just keep reading. No one will ever listen to this. So it doesn't matter what you do, dude. It really doesn't. You don't even have to do this. The Book of the Charioteer, Part 4. I had much to think about, my great-grandfather told us, as we were rowed across to the western bank of Thebes. I had just heard the most powerful voice ever to enter my head, and my ears rang. In other years, when I became a priest and was instructed in the mysteries of language, I came to learn that the sounds uttered by a god are equal to what he desires. So, in ancient days, a god would say, "Chair," and lo, there was a chair. Of course, in these years, we are not close to the gods. We can roar like a lion, but we can never call the beast forth. I, however, on this morning of which I speak, had just heard a mighty voice issue from a heart of gold. It had captured the lips and throat of Bokni Khonsu, and made him serve as the voice of Aman, so we knew that victory would be ours if we were faithful. That, all the same, was what dismayed me now. Today, our religious ceremonies had been different from other occasions. Usually, 10 or more priests entered with a bull, not a ram. And a reciter priest would stand at my pharaoh's elbow and whisper which prayer came next, or how many steps to take. They have such a fellow today, said Tanem-Hotep, but his manner is not altogether civil. It was otherwise then, said Menenhedit, and done with great respect. Once I counted 100 separate gestures accompanying one prayer, and, in my ignorance, missed another 100 I would learn later as a priest. How then could a monarch like Ramses II, with his mind fixed on war, remember the order? Yet if the king could avoid all mistakes during the service, it was our belief that we were simple in those days. I repeat, that Aman would not ignore our request. In truth, I remember how at the beginning of many a service, Bokni Khonsu would often place into the golden hand of Aman a roll of papyrus on which the high priest had written a petition. Then, at the completion of prayer, Bokni Khonsu would take it back, feeling its presence in his palm. He would be able to state whether the great god wished to say yes or no to the request. Of course, I always believed Bokni Khonsu could interpret the word of Aman. There were other high priests, however, in other years, whom I did not trust as well. I thought the answers to their petitions told me more about the servant than about the wisdom of Aman. All the same, when I became a high priest myself, and I was, I must say, no model of purity like Bokni Khonsu, but reached such a position only by my nearness to Ramses II in my second life, when I was young and he was very old. I learned that I, too, was not ready to pass over the word of God. No, the feelings of Aman were too fearsome to ignore when the roll of papyrus quivered in one's hands. Your lives are as strange as the taste of a new spice, said our pharaoh, and smiled at my mother. At this sign of attention given to her, first in some time, she was quick to smile back. But in her mind, and I, listening to our great-grandfather with all my attention, had not been near to her mind for a while. Now saw her hand move forward in her thoughts to touch her fingertips to a surface as lovely as her own skin. But it was under the skirt of Tanem-Otep that her hand would travel, and his thigh was the one who stroked her thoughts. Upon which the pharaoh sat up in his chair and felt for his leopard tail. You are speaking, he said to Menenhetet, for the power of petition of a high priest? This is too close. Oh my God, get out of my face. Oh my God, get me away. Okay. You were speaking, he said to Menenhetet, with his granddaughter's hand up his skirt, of the power of petition of a high priest. Hi, Lotus. Yes, said my great-grandfather. If my request asked the pharaoh to enrich the temple of Thebes, I would know the answer I desired. A high priest must increase the wealth of his temple. Amon's confidence being gained by gifts, it is gained best by great gifts. So my petition might beg Amon to instruct our old Ramses to give over to the temple 1/10 more of the tribute he had received from Libya the last year. My hand, as it touched the petition, expected to hear no response from Amon, but yes, yet with all my desire, no response from Amon, but yes, yet with all my desire for such a result, I could feel the clear displeasure of the hidden one. If on a given morning he did not desire such added tribute. Did you then announce this conclusion? Tanem-Otep asked. I cannot remember, my lord. My only recollection is that I would dread such a reply when it came on me. How awful was the touch of the petition when it said no. The papyrus could feel as unpleasant as snakeskin. Hold on. Just chill out. Hi. Hey, thanks for waiting. Now I, of course, on the day we crossed the river to visit the tomb of Ramses II, knew little of these fine matters. I only understood that nothing had taken place, as on other mornings. I was not surprised, therefore, that it became a day where every event was unexpected. No sooner had we landed on the wharf in the western bank of Thebes than my pharaoh invited me into his chariot for the first time, and the horses were as shocked as myself to recognize that Nefertiti was not present. The names of these horses, I remember, were Strength of Thebes and Maat is Satisfied, M-A-A-T, a stallion and a mare. And the mare, as you would expect, was remarkably like Nefertiti. She never liked to be separated from her mate. You had only to command Strength of Thebes, and it was as if you had spoken to the 8 legs of both beasts. Nor were these horses ever happier than when the queen rode with the king. But my Ramses drove off with me, leaving all who had come with us behind. So I now learned that the people of western Thebes, accustomed to see their king only in a procession, did not know how to look up when his chariot was unaccompanied. They were left with no more than a glimpse of the war crown on his head, thereby to realize that the good and great God had passed, O double house of Egypt, said my great-grandfather, as if apologizing that a pharaoh could ride anywhere in Egypt without everyone being aware of his passage. Menenhedet then struck the table 7 times with his hand, as if to ward off any disrespect in what he would next say. On this, the night of the pig, I could speak of many pharaohs. I have known them as gods, and I have known them as men. Of them all, if it please your interest, it does. Ramses II, if it pleases your interest, it does, says TBOTC. Ramses II was the least difficult to know as a pharaoh, and the most difficult to comprehend as a man. Of his piety, I have just given you good measure. Yet when he was away from the temple, he was indifferent to who might hear his voice. He swore as simply as a soldier, and when with Nefertiti, he was never more like a man in love than a king. He was more like a man in love than a king. Yet if she was not with us, he hardly spoke of her with respect. On this morning, as we started off in his chariot, he even said, "Do you know she had a fit because I told her to stay on the eastern bank?" "Go back," I told her. "Nurse what you must nurse. I want to be alone," my pharaoh laughed. "She does not like to nurse." He added, "She doesn't even like her wet nurse." And he gave a great whoop to the horses and a crack of the reins on their back. So we were in a gallop right out of a trot and tearing down the boulevard of Osiris on the western bank like 2 charioteers with an afternoon to spend on beer. Yes, now I see he was different from other kings. The weight of other pharaohs can be seen in their presence on all occasions. But my good Ramses II thought little of that. Like a boy, he would take off his clothes if it suited him. He had a mouth that would look at you as if he did not know whether he wanted a kiss or a bite out of your best parts. Best parts. My mother gave a laugh so full of the depths of her own flesh that I could all but feel the black hair between her legs and the red face of a young man with golden hair and lips as red as my mother's smiling at the sight. I felt sweet finger again. Except there were 100 sweet fingers up her belly and down mine. And I wondered if this man with the golden hair could be Ramses II, come forward from the dead. And that confused me so thoroughly that I only returned to what my great-grandfather was saying on these words. I never liked the Western Bank. Well, I do not like it today, said TBOTC, and with such vehemence that I saw the picture in his brain. That is, I saw the western banks as it would look to me now from a boat in the middle of the river. Thereby I had the sight of a plain with high cliffs to the west and many temples in the valley. There were great broad avenues going in every direction, yet it did not look like a city so much as a park. And then not at all like a royal park, for there were swamps between some of the avenues, and long empty diggings of foundations where great buildings must have been planned and never finished. I could see very few people on the boulevards, and only one or two wagons. This meant the western bank must be altogether different from the east bank of Thebes, which, if it were at all like Memphis, had to be crowded, and friendly, and full of narrow alleys. Whereas on the western bank, there was so much space that you could see a number of new towns being built in regular rows between the great boulevards and climbing into the foothills. But since each stone house in these places had a little pyramid for its roof, I realized they were not houses but tombs in the great necropolis of western Thebes, and indeed looked like 1,000 hats planted in the desert, with over there another 1,000 hats. Yet the plan of each street was so much the same that my eyes began to water, and I wondered if living people really thought the dead liked to live on streets that did not curve. My great-grandfather must have heard each of my thoughts, unless I was living in his. For now I heard him say, the streets of the necropolis were laid out in right angles on the calculation that the best return is brought back from land sold in small, square pieces. Menenhetet, you are wicked, the pharaoh remarked. I always thought these streets were kept straight to discourage thieves and evil spirits. Hold on. One, two, three, four. That is also true, said my great-grandfather. Fewer guards are necessary when one can see from one end of a lane to the other. And spirits are certainly weakened when they cannot dodge and turn. Yet when the decision was first made in the temple of Ammon at Karnak to lay out square plots, none of us knew they would prove so popular. I was high priest at the time, and can tell you we needed the revenue. I speak of a period 50 years and more after the Battle of Kadesh, when Ramses II was very old and had no interest in war. So the temple could only count on the tribute that still came from the sons of old conquered princes. Thereby we had fewer gifts for Ammon. Contemplate the labors. Hi, Lotus. Hi, baby. Yeah, we'll go somewhere. Just chill out. Don't worry. Hi, Lotus. Yeah, we'll go somewhere. Yeah, I promise. I speak of a period 50 years and more after the Battle of Kadesh, when Ramses II was very old and had no interest in war. So the temple could only count on the tribute. Okay, I already read this. That still came in from the sons of old conquered princes. So they're like still paying. Thereby we had fewer gifts for Ammon. Contemplate the labors of a high priest. Like myself, when each morning the great god sneered at me each time I wiped off his old rouge and tongue and pure and put on the new. Let's see if I know what's going on so far. So he's still talking. He's talking about how much he really loved the last Ramses. That's pretty much it. Right? I came to the simple conclusion that gifts to make Amon happy did not... I'm lost. Should I just give up right now? Well, I don't know. Okay. I came to the simple conclusion that gifts to make Amon happy did not have to come only from pharaohs. Many of the people were wealthy enough to buy plots in the necropolis. Now I must explain that even on the strange morning of which I speak, when Ramses II gave me the honor of accompanying him, there was a necropolis on the western bank. Only it was not like the one today, with its thousands of tombs. In that time, there were only a few great avenues. The necropolis itself was small, and no one but nobles of the best family could be buried in it. I remember the envy I felt at the thought that I would never rest on the western bank. But it seemed to me that a man who had been welcomed into the company of a pharaoh ought to be entitled to a tomb, and have the history of his life written on the walls. But I knew that was impossible. If you were not a great noble and could not begin in those years to think of a life in the land of the dead, you could not begin in those years to think of a life in the land of the dead. Among the peasants with whom I grew up, we were always heard that the pits of Kurt Netter were so terrible, and you encountered such serpents, scorpions, and evil gods that only I'm losing it. I'm so not interested in this chapter. I don't know. I just feel like Menenhette is boring voice. We always heard that the pits of Kurtnetter, which is like the hell of these people, I think, were so terrible, and you encountered such serpents, scorpions, and evil gods that only a pharaoh or a few of his royal brothers would dare to make the trip down to the Duad. That's the river of the dead. For any ordinary man, the journey was impossible. So, as soon as you died, you expected your family to take you out in the desert, dig a hole, and cover you with sand. If you were a peasant, you didn't even brood about it much. But when I became a charioteer, it irked me how many relatives of the pharaoh had a tomb and could take treasures with them through Kurtnetter. No, that's like where you walk through to go to. And after this day when I rode in his chariot, the desire to have a plot in the royal city of the dead rose in me. So when I became a high priest many years later, I knew that rich commoners would want to purchase land in this necropolis because of a special element. However, if I may speak in the character of Ramses the Great, which developed after the Battle of Kadesh, we did not have to sell to commoners after all. For by his old age, thousands of people in Thebes could claim to be his children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren. At the least, they were married to his descendants. By then, only the poorest commoner could not claim to be some kind of kin to the usurmer Setpener, that's something. It's called the Son Who is Powerful Through Truth. Ramses II. That, however, was after the Battle of Kadesh. On this day, riding with pride in his chariot, who could think of all that was to come? I merely looked at what there was to see when he took us along. I merely looked at what there was to see while he took us along on a fast gallop down the empty boulevards of western Thebes. There were not many people there then, as I say, as they all worked for the necropolis and in the mortuary temples, and looked sicklier somehow to my good eyes than the people of the East Bank. Even the priests of the mortuary temples seemed thin and drawn compared to those priests who came walking through the great hall that is like a forest in the temple of Karnak. Although these fellows at Karnak also live much in the shade, they grow plump from the sacrifices that they consume and the gold that they weigh in the vaults, whereas the ones on the western bank, while quite free to enjoy all the quiet sun of all their fine gardens and plazas, were bored, I think, by the peace of the ages that you had to breathe in western Thebes. In western Thebes. I think most of these priests wanted to be across the river at Karnak, and so their unhappiness came to the air. By late afternoon, I knew it would be mournful, so long as the sun was still high. And it was all right, but soon terrible shadows would flow like water from the cliffs to cover the temple gardens with gloom. What am I talking about here? Just kind of talking about, like, how these guys are upset, because I'm missing something. All the while, I did not know where my pharaoh was taking me. But he had decided to visit no place less splendid than the temple of Hatshepsut. As we drove up, there were, to my surprise, not a dozen priests to turn out. But there was not even the smell of a sacrifice burning. I think we might have been the first people to visit in days. Of course, it had been built by a woman and looked more like a palace than a temple. But my pharaoh said, I used to laugh at this place. Only a woman would build a temple with nothing but cocks, and clap me on the back like we were two infantrymen. What is he talking about? I was shocked at how he spoke. But then he did say, count the cocks. And I did. And there were 24 columns, all holding up a roof. And above was another row of shorter columns. Altogether, a white and beautiful temple, and very large. And the cliffs went straight up to the sky, just back of the temple. When my king had chased away the priests who came to greet him, we mounted onto a patio above the first roof, and there was a garden with hundreds of myrrh trees. I had smelled myrrh in every incense that smoked in a temple, and I knew the power of its odor. But here in the shadow of these cliffs, which must have been higher than 100 men standing on top of each other's shoulders, in the sun of midday, with the desert yellow of the hills all around us, the scent of myrrh from each of these little trees was an odor to fill my head and make me think that the middle of my thoughts could be as clear and empty as the sky.